Hi, this is Eric Cohn, executive producer and host of Act in Line. And before this week's episode, I want to briefly tell you about our upcoming Poverty Cure Summit, an Acton Institute event. The Poverty Cure Summit is a premier digital experience. You'll have the opportunity to hear scholars, human service providers, and practitioners address the most critical issues we face today, which can either exacerbate or alleviate poverty. With conversations rooted in foundational principles of anthropology, politics, natural law, and economics, you'll gain a deeper understanding of the root causes of poverty and identify practical means to reducing it and promoting human flourishing. Featured speakers include Amity Schlaze, Anthony Bradley, Philip Booth, Isis Brantley, Peter Greer, Mauricio Miller, Anne Rathbone Bradley, Jay Richards, and many more. The Poverty Cure Summit will take place November 18th and 19th, virtually, so you can join from the comfort of your living room. Registration for the Poverty Cure Summit is $99, but if you visit povertycuresummit.org right now and enter the discount code ACTINLINE, all one word, at checkout, you can register now for only $49. Just enter the discount code ACTINLINE, all one word, at checkout. Your Poverty Cure Summit registration includes access to main stage sessions, a diverse range of panel discussions with experts and practitioners, interactive question and answer sessions with our panelists, and networking opportunities with summit attendees. Join the conversation and be a part of the cure. To register or learn more, visit povertycuresummit.org. That's povertycuresummit.org today. Welcome to Act in Line, the podcast of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. The conservative movement in America has always been evolving. From the old right of the progressive era to the conservative intellectual movement identified with William F. Buckley Jr. and National Review, to the Reagan Revolution, to today. The political right in America has changed with the challenges it has faced and with the context of the times in which it has existed. The current iteration of the conservative movement is today more nationalist, more populist, and more skeptical, if not opposed, to classical liberalism, liberal institutions, and free markets than ever before, at times even expressing doubt or skepticism about the American founding itself. How did the conservative movement get here? Today, we talk with Matthew Continetti, a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, about the history of the American conservative movement, its evolution into being dominated by nationalism and populism, and where it may be headed in the future. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Act in Line on our website at acton.org/acton-line. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Act in Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. I'm joined today by Matthew Continetti. Matt is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, focused on American political thought and history, with a particular focus on the development of the Republican Party and the American conservative movement in the 20th century. He was also the founding editor and editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon. Prior to that, he was opinion editor at the Weekly Standard. Matt Continetti, welcome to Act in Line.
Thanks for having me.
So I heard a recent interview with you where you talked about the book you're working on the history of conservatism. And I've been myself reading through the George Nash book on the history of the American conservative movement. And you talked about how you've identified really 4 different conservative movements. And when the book comes out, we'd love to have you on and do a real deep dive on the history of conservatism. But for our audience, just so we can get to the kind of where conservatism is today, can you give a quick overview of these 4 conservative movements that you've identified?
Sure. The story I tell in this book I'm writing begins basically in the progressive era with the Woodrow Wilson presidency. And between that time, so let's just say 1917, the year that America enters World War I and becomes a world power, and 2017, those are kind of the bookends of the project I'm currently working on. There are really kind of four rights during this period. The first right I characterize as anti-statist and also anti-interventionist. So this was the right really beginning in the progressive era up through American entry into World War II with the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so it was very kind of libertarian, free market, anti-statist, individualist, but also very much anti-interventionist, anti-war. America needs to avoid entanglement in European great power conflict and focus on preserving freedom and acting as a emblem of freedom for the world at home. So that was the first one. And like I say, that basically ended with the attack on Pearl Harbor. So, within days of the attack, the America First Committee, which was widely popular for the first 2 years of World War II here in America, basically disbanded. And so that was the end of that first right. And the second right that came about was anti-statist, but it was also anti-communist. And so this is the right that we kind of say was the beginning of the conservative intellectual movement or the conservative movement in America, because it's the right of William F. Buckley Jr. and the National Review. Buckley, refers to himself as an individualist in his first book, God and Man at Yale, 1951. But by the time he writes Up from Liberalism in 1959, he's a conservative. And so that's kind of, I think, tracing that inflection from a foreign policy of anti-intervention, anti-war, to a foreign policy of really assertive anti-communism, not only at home, in terms of counter-subversion and support for the McCarthy hearings and various counter-subversive efforts in the U.S. Congress, but also abroad. And, people forget that someone like Joe McCarthy was actually an internationalist in foreign policy. He supported NATO. He thought that we needed to be engaged in Europe to fight communism. So that's the second right. The third right, I kind of date with basically the period between 1976 and 1980, the ascent of Ronald Reagan in American politics. Now, why I call that right is basically pro-market and pro-democracy. It's not necessarily anti-statist because Ronald Reagan's elected president, the Republicans capture the Senate for the first time since the Eisenhower era. So you're in charge of the state. It's hard to be anti-statist when you're in charge of the state. So how do conservatives deal with this reality? Well, they kind of change their tonalities to be more just pro-market, expanding markets, market freedoms. So less anti than pro. And that's also the same on foreign policy, because during this time, rather than being hardline anti-communists, which of course that was still a major part, the focus also begins to shift on creating and supporting what Reagan, in his address to the British Parliament of Westminster in 1982, called the architecture of democracy, the infrastructure of democracy. Pro-democracy. So we're going to not only improve American security, but we're also going to improve the condition of the world by spreading American principles of democratic governance and free markets throughout the world. And this, of course, is best represented by Francis Fukuyama's famous essay, The End of History, ? By the time it became a book a few years later, he had lost the question mark. It was the end of history. So that's number three. Finally, I think we're in stage four, or the fourth right.
Stage four makes it sound more ominous.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Well, the nice thing about my story is it has a beginning, middle, and end. This right is populist and nationalist. Now, there was always elements of populism and nationalism in the American right throughout all of these phases. But I think you see here, beginning really in the first glimmers of it are in 2008 with the selection of Sarah Palin as John McCain's running mate and the reaction to that among the grassroots. but continuing throughout the Obama years, and of course culminating in Donald Trump's nomination and presidential victory, you see a right that is extreme. So what is populist? Was extremely anti-elitist. It's majoritarian. The majority they have in mind is basically the majority of conservatives, or basically the majority of people who were comfortable in the world in say 30 years ago in 1980 when I was born. That's the people that the American right has in mind. And then it's also nationalist. So the foreign policy it's not really anti-communist, because communism is not a global ideology in the way it was during the Cold War. But it's also not pro-democracy, because that is not a priority of Donald Trump. And so what it is nationalist. It's looking out for America first, right? Trump appropriating the name of the committee during the run-up to World War II. It's going to be very unilateralist, so it doesn't care about multilateral alliances or international institutions. Again, conservatives have always been skeptical of those things, but this new phase takes it to a different level, I think. And it's going to, assert U.S. power, but for extremely narrow interests. And then it's going to play up this larger sense of national identity, not only vis-a-vis immigrants, but also against powers like China.
So you mentioned that there's always been a populist element in the right, and we can go back to Bill Buckley with the rather be governed by the first 500 names in the Boston telephone directory than by the faculty of Harvard University, which I always took to mean, maybe he'd be more comfortable with Yale, but then again, God and man at Yale probably tells you he wouldn't. So there's always this populist element in there. You mentioned the nomination of Sarah Palin. Do you really peg that as the transition point to when populism becomes more of a driving force in the American right, or does it, when does the transition period, I guess, between, the third stage of the right and this current nationalist populist stage of the right begin?
I think the failures of the George W. Bush presidency in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then having kind of the capstone to his presidency be the global financial crisis of 2008, that kind of like cleared the deck in a way of I think Reaganism in a lot of ways, and I'm a partisan of Reagan, so I say that sadly, but also kind of Bush's attempt at fusionism was called compassionate conservatism. That kind of went with him. So personality-wise, I've always thought, and I wrote a book about Sarah Palin, and the year after this election, in 2009, it came out. I always thought Palin perfectly represented kind of the new constituencies of the American right. She was a mother of five. She was a Bible-believing Christian. She did not come up through the traditional merit, obsessed credentialing network of the Ivy Leagues and such. She did not live on the East Coast. In fact, she lived about as far away from the East Coast as you can and still be American. And she had a common touch. I mean, that was clear in the reaction to her from so many Republican voters. It was electric. And so I think she was kind of a precursor to what came down the pike with Trump. And, the recent death of Herman Cain reminded me that in many ways, Herman Cain was also a premonition of what was happening because, for a while there, Herman Cain was riding high in 2011. He represented the businessman, the outsider, very conservative man, social conservative. Remember he talked about the moats to keep out the illegal immigrants and the electric fences. Okay, where are we headed with this, right? Mm-hmm. Of course, his campaign was sidelined with the accusations of sexual harassment in December 2011. And the difference between him and Donald Trump is Donald Trump just pressed ahead when similar accusations were leveled against him. So you're right. So this is a current that's happening for a while, and and it goes to the kind of the roots of American conservatism, which is that it's a dissident movement. It's not a movement. Most conservatives are protecting something, but unfortunately for American conservatives, the game was almost over by the time that we emerged as a movement, because progressivism and liberalism had captured the universities, the media, large swaths of the government. People just thought thought liberally in the government. So we've always kind of been a movement of protest, and that adds to its populist flavor. So the global financial crisis, the reaction to the war in Iraq, I think was very important in creating this new populist nationalist movement, which you also saw, I think, in the Tea Party. I think people misread, people including me misread the Tea Party. Though I wrote at the time that the Tea Party was more complicated than people thought. It had a more conspiracy-minded side to it. A lot of conservative intellectuals interpreted the Tea Party as a kind of a constitutional conservative force, which it was. There's no question about it. But it was also one that the Tea Party's definition of elites included conservative elites. Right? So that's the thing that conservative intellectuals didn't realize, is that they, according to the Tea Party, they were part of the problem too. And this has led to their estrangement from the movement that they helped bring into being at the moment.
Once upon a time, was a spokesman for the Chicago Tea Party and can attest to the complicated nature, and to how, aside from hearing a lot about Barack Obama at the time, the vitriol directed at Republicans and conservative intellectuals, really the elite in Washington and New York, really was the thing I heard probably second most. I completely understand what you're saying there. One thing that seems to be different now with this current populist nationalist conservative movement is the rise of illiberalism. And, in a way, what you just mentioned about how progressivism had kind of captured the entire apparatus of the state and culture, and we tend to use still liberal interchangeably with progressive, while at the same time having this growing. So in that sense, the conservative movement being anti-liberal would make complete sense 50 years ago. But now we're kind of getting into these proper, almost more European definitions of liberalism. And there is a decided strain within this conservative movement that is illiberal or anti-liberal. Where do you think this is coming from? Were there always undercurrents of this in the previous incarnations of the right? Or is this a new phenomenon?
It's not new. I think if you look to the Southern agrarians in the 1930s, to the publication, the agrarians created many publications, but one they wrote for was called the American Review, which was published by this kind of literateur named Seward Collins. Collins was a monarchist and ended up a fascist. The agrarians weren't quite there. They believed in certain forms of constitutionalism, but they also were very much anti-modern in the sense that they thought that the North represented the triumph of modernity and industrial capitalism and democracy, and that is majoritarian rule. And these were all things that the agrarians blanched at. So this is a movement that is almost 100 years old. And you see it again, I think, in some of the debates between Buckley and his brother-in-law, Brent Bozell, surrounding the creation of Triumph magazine, and Bozell's kind of vector of intellectual development, going from being the ghostwriter of Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative, which is really the text, if you will, of what is called fusionist conservatism, or the mainstream of American conservatism for most of the last century. Going from there to going to real kind of questioning the foundations of the American Republic as ill-founded, supporting kind of Spanish monarchism and the Carlista movement. So that was 60s, 70s. And so you see it in I think some of the writings of a few of the so-called paleoconservative intellectuals, especially the theorist Samuel Francis, who felt that in a lot of ways American democracy was just a misnomer, that constitutionalism, liberalism, these were all outmoded things. And so he advocated a national populist strategy of politics. And so it's definitely been part of, I think, the intellectual currents on the American right for a long time. What's happened now is there's no countervailing forces to push against it, because so many of the basically the legitimating institutions of the American right are considered by large numbers of national populists or conservatives themselves to be illegitimate and corrupt. And so there's this, you also have a president who, well, I think that if you told Donald Trump, we really need to look at medieval forms of political allegiance, he would look at you like you're a crazy person. Nonetheless, he kind of allows space for a wide variety of political thought that was not mainstream prior to his rise. And so it's a combination of factors, not only the kind of dislocations within the institutional foundations of the American right, not only Donald Trump, but then also I think with conservative Catholics in particular, a real sense of cultural despair and loss because of certain decisions by the Supreme Court, as well as just certain changes in American culture and popular culture, a sense of cultural despair that is leading them to reconsider not only kind of this mainstream conservatism, but also the America itself.
So you identify that, what I guess would be the Catholic integralist critique of all of this, which I, from my own personal perspective and as someone working at the Acton Institute, find somewhat fascinating, that it seems to be a very small movement, but with quite enormous aspirations, that this idea that you can have kind of a confessional state is, in America, I've always told my Catholic integralist friends that, if I were even to agree that there's the possibility of there being a religiously infused state in the United States of America, it's probably going to be Protestant, not Catholic, given the makeup of the country. Is it that cultural despair, you think, that primarily drives all of that? You hear often the critique of what is conservatism conserved. And I guess to me, the problem there is, well, how again are we defining conservatism here? If you're defining conservatism the way that I generally always have, and I think you do as well, of conserving the American founding to the greatest extent we can, then, sure, I think we've conserved quite a lot. And there's quite a lot as well that we can disagree with and think that needs change or improvement or places where we have gone wrong. If the idea is to conserve something that predates the American founding, well, that seems to be a more salient critique, even if it's one that I think I dissent from. Right.
I mean, this is a question that each conservative has to answer. What are we attempting to conserve? And I agree with you. For me, as an American conservative, what the adjective really matters. It's conserving the institutions and principles of the American founding. That's the point for me. Now, Robert Nisbet, who the late sociologist who I've done quite a bit of research on, he would say that you're a conservative because you want to conserve kind of historically formed social institutions. In the European context, that is things like the class structure or the monarchy or the established churches. In America, we have governmental institutions. We have the Constitution, the principles of the Declaration of Independence. That's kind of what you and I are talking about conserving. But we also do have historically formed social institutions. They're just part of civil society. So we have the family, we have churches, we have neighborhoods, and we have voluntary associations. I do feel conservatives American conservatives have done a poor job of conserving those four things. Okay, and I think the reason that is because the American conservative movement has been primarily a intellectual and political movement. It has not been a movement in civil society, and the movements in civil society have tended to be grassroots driven. They've been partly successful. One, education reform, I think, has been pretty successful, but in terms of the American family, which is in many ways the most important social institution, we cannot say that we've been successful because the American family is in a pretty bad place. So I think a lot of religious conservatives look at that. They're looking at those institutions. They're looking at family, the health of religion in society. They're looking at neighborhoods, what we mean by neighborhoods or small towns. And they're looking at voluntary associations, kind of, church raisings, barn raisings. And there, I think they have a lot of legitimate complaint. Now, to go from that point to then say that America itself is ill-founded and corrupt, and we need to reconsider anti-constitutional politics, that I can't go. I will never go there, right? But I do think we look at these historically formed social formations, and we have to really commit ourselves to trying to renew them as conservatives, because at the end of the day, they are the bedrock of society as we understand it. And so I think that kind of sense of despair, that looking at what's happened to the family, looking at kind of the very unusual developments in American religion, kind of the rise of the NONESs, the nuns, religious disaffiliation, lower rates of church attendance. I think if you look at the millennial and Zoomers, you see also a change in the attitude toward religion. One where the millennials and Zoomers, large numbers of them, which is unusual when compared with other generations, large numbers of these cohorts look at religion as a force of intolerance and a repression. And you have to begin to wonder, okay, how do we fix this? So there are various strategies, but the Rod Dreher strategy is, let's drop out. Let's drop out, form our counterculture, do what we can to kind of preserve our way of life. And then there's, there's kind of the Deneen strategy, which is more, I think, a more critique than it is a plan, though I understand that he's working on another follow-up that may be more propositional, or at least kind of more this is what we should do. And then finally, there's kind of the Vermeule Amari type strain, which is, the reason we've got into this place is political liberalism. Not the liberalism of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but the liberalism of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. And we therefore need to begin to pursue anti-liberal strategies, or think outside that framework. Procedural, I think the phrase, procedural norms, or I forget exactly what it is in one of Amari's essays, but it's when we were in grade school, this would be called thinking outside the box.
Yes.
Really. That's what really it is. It's definitely thinking outside the box.
The previous incarnations of conservatism seem to accept evolved change through market processes, the Schumpeterian creative destruction that comes with free markets and with capitalism. Do you think the current nationalist, populist, conservative movement is still accepting of that? Are these things still compatible with this new brand of conservatism?
Well, I think one thing every analyst needs to do is separate what goes on online from what is actually going on in America. And I do think that if you look at the discussion online, it would appear that, oh my gosh, we're going to have an integralist America in my lifetime.
Twitter is not reality, though.
All the young people online, all the people who are interested in ideas, it seems to me, are definitely moving toward these not only national populists, but even deeper critiques of America and Western civilization. I don't necessarily think that's the reality. I think when you actually poll Republican voters, who would be the core of any of this, what you find is more or less just what you expect: the socially conservative, pro-business, pro-market, supportive of Donald Trump, but also, kind of leery of Donald Trump a lot of the time, and wish he would tweet less. And gosh, does he have to do these things that, these unforced errors? So the discussions are very different. And I even think among younger conservatives, you find a great variety. Like I say, there are plenty of young conservatives, young social conservatives in particular, who are very much attracted to these ideas because they, to them, are new ideas, and they're exciting ideas, and they're radical ideas. And if you're young, you like radical ideas. But in terms of actual millennial Americans or Zoomers who are in the right, I don't know if that's really their the reason they get up in the morning, or the reason that they're thinking of voting Republican. Many of them might like Donald Trump. There are many who don't, and think that, well, Trump is just a phase, or just a kind of a hiccup of history, and there will be a right that's more in the Reaganite tradition, say, that follows him. We really don't know. But I think just for the health of the American right, it needs to be American. It needs to focus on what makes America unique, because I think we still are a pretty patriotic country. People understand the American idea differently. The left tends to focus on the equality, right? The right tends to focus on the liberty, but it's still within that framework of the American idea. You can argue over the American idea. Once you start abandoning the American idea, I think that you're going to have a lot of trouble being a influential voice in the American conversation. And let's not forget, the right was not influential in any sphere of life for decades, right? It took a lot of sustained effort on the part of William F. Buckley Jr. and his colleagues to legitimize the right in the eyes of American elites. And from my perspective, that effort is at risk of being wasted in the coming years, and having the American right going back to kind of its origins, which were on the sidelines of the American conversation.
Does that necessitate a willingness to, I guess, back away in some sense from the anti-elitism and be willing to engage in those elite cultural institutions and with other cultural elites? Because Buckley, with Firing Line, with National Review, it was, I think I heard you in the interview with Jonah Goldberg talk about this, that it very much is pitched at elites. And go back to what we were saying about the Tea Party, where there very much is a departure from even caring about elite institutions or cultural elites at all.
That's a problematic approach these days, because I'm not sure Buckley would be given the hearing that he was given in some of these institutions you mentioned. So when Buckley wrote "Got a Man at Yale," in the first phase of his career, I mean, he was a tyro. He was definitely anti-elitist, but he was a kind of this insider-outsider, because he was coming from within the institutions, and he came from money. His father was wealthy from oil, but because of his weird mix of personal influences, he was Catholic, he was Southern, because both of his parents were Southern, even though he grew up in Connecticut and went to school overseas and had that strange accent. So he was in but not of, right? Mm-hmm. These institutions. And so he was attacked vociferously in the pages of the Atlantic Monthly for writing this book on Yale. And then, of course, his follow-up is defending Joe McCarthy. I mean, if you want, if you want to be controversial, defend Joe McCarthy to this day, you know? So he nonetheless felt that, and this was really the influence of James Burnham, I think, he nonetheless felt that for American conservatism to be successful, it would have to appeal to basically the graduates of the Ivy League, the people who would go on to important roles in business and in media, in politics, maybe even the university itself. Though, like I say, by 1951, Buckley was saying that the university was a lost cause, that it's 60 some years later now. I don't know whether that's possible today. I really don't, because you have no entree into these institutions. I mean, the John Shields book about professors on the right and how small they are, and how their numbers are just incredibly, vanishingly small. And there is a culture of fear, I think, on a lot of campuses, especially among young faculty, that if they say what they think, they will be hounded out of the institution. Media is the same way. I mean, there's just no. If you consider the Barry Weiss resignation, look at what's happened to Andrew Sullivan, who's not. I mean, Andrew thinks he's a conservative, sure, okay, but he's definitely not a
unorthodox
progressive.
Yeah.
Put it that way, right? He felt he had to leave New York Magazine. It'd be hard. It would really be hard. So I think there's new strategies have to be thought out. One part, conservatives have done a pretty good job of creating counter institutions and a counterculture.
I was just going to ask that, is that how much of the environment do you attribute to what I think we can all recognize as the hostility of the modern American left to, again, to a lot of Buckley references here, but the left claims that they want to hear other views and then are shocked and appalled to find out that there are other views. How much of it is that kind of hostility from the American left in these institutions to anybody being outside of the way they think, and how much of it is kind of a conservative abandonment of the institutions to say, we're going to build our own, we're going to build our Hillsdale colleges, we're going to establish our own media enterprises. What do you think the balance is between those two?
Well, I think the liberal intolerance came first. I do. And I felt, and especially if you think about the growth of think tanks in kind of this, 70s and 80s, a lot of that was just academics who could not stay in the university setting. They're just tired of it. It just couldn't persist. So I do think that came first. The interesting thing about these counter institutions is they don't really have much of a social base. So they're not. I mean, there's the religious new right, which has a large social base, and still does. But once beyond that, you don't get, I think, what the Marxists would call class consciousness about, people who are, tied to a specific institution. For example, that unions, or don't take public sector unions, because those are never going to go for an American right that is just by its nature skeptical of government. But trades unions, for various reasons, the American conservative movement never tried to appeal to these groups. But if you were able to, you would have had a solid institutional base. You would have gotten to know people, actual working people. And by the way, these people, these trades unionists that I'm saying, sometimes they voted Republican. So they voted for Ronald Reagan. Those are the Reagan Democrats. They voted for Donald Trump, that type of strategy, I think, is worth thinking about, especially if we're concerned about the health of civil society. People on the right tend to disinclude the unions in our definition of civil society, primarily because we are thinking of the public sector unions, but also because the American right has long been committed to kind of an anti-union, right-to-work agenda.
One final question. So as you've identified these four American rights, and we talked a little about the transition periods in between them, were there any signs of the transition between the old right of the progressive era into the anti-statist, anti-communist, and those evolutions? And if there are, do you see anything out there right now that gives you an indication of where you think the conservative movement might be going in the future if it were to evolve beyond the nationalist populist right that exists now into something else?
Well, one thing that happens in these transitions is the introduction of a new coterie or network of right-leaning thinkers. So if you think about the difference between right, you mentioned the old right, and that's what it was. It was the anti-statist, anti-interventionist right. To this day, the partisans of the old right are very hostile toward National Review, because National Review was mainly staffed by ex-communists. Okay, and these ex-communists kind of came into the American right, and even then, 100 years ago, they were viewed as interlopers. James Burnham, Frank Meyer. The two key influences on William F. Buckley Jr. Wilmer Kendall, it's unclear whether he was actually a Trotskyist when he was in Spain in the 1930s, but he was on the left, and for sure. And then he becomes Buckley's teacher at Yale and his mentor until they had multiple falling downs. But so that happens. So that's the transition between the first and second. And then if you think about the transition between the second and third, there's another group. And these are the neoconservatives. These are the Democrats or the first neoconservatives were actual members of the radical left who became more conservative. But then you had a second wave of neocons who were basically Cold War liberals who switched their affiliation, moved to the right, and that changed the inflection, right? So when I look out at the intellectual scene today, I see the person I'm most fascinated with is Thomas Chatterton Williams, because one is I read his first book a few years ago. I thought it was excellent, and I've been reading him ever since. And I've just kind of noticed it's fascinating to watch how he's like slowly going down this path, a path that I went down. And it's kind of will take you to a situation. Might not be you might not think of yourself as on the right, but it's definitely critical of liberalism and progressivism and radicalism. Mm-hmm. So if there was a critical mass of individuals like Chatterton Williams, then that might change the right. But at the moment, I don't see the American right going in a different direction for a few reasons. One is just it's a secular trend, which is the Republican Party has been growing more working class every year and more reliant on voters without college degrees. And this is going to continue, I think, for the foreseeable future. And that lends itself just to a national populism. Two is there is a lot of incentives to the type of to maintain the type of American right we have now. There are a lot of just structural incentives, and it's unclear whether those will change. And then there's always the influence of the president himself. And even if the president were to lose the election in 2020, I still think he will exercise some degree of influence on the developments in the Republican Party and on the American right.
Since you mentioned Thomas Chatterton Williams, real quick before we end here, and are there any other particularly interesting thinkers or writers out there that you would point people to in that same vein of, if they are in the vanguard of something coming in the future? Anyone in addition to Thomas Chatterton Williams?
From someone who's coming from a left liberal perspective, there's this political scientist named James Lindsay who co-wrote a book on theory with a capital T that Andrew Sullivan writes quite a bit about. He seems interesting. I like it. This is the problem, is that it's not clear, who the members of this new network are, and like I say, that the Yasha Monk publication Persuasion, which I think Thomas Chatterton Williams is associated with, that is definitely not a right wing publication, and so it may be that they won't that the term conservative is so delegitimized in the eyes of America's elites, or that is non-conservative elites, that just won't be able to adopt it. And, people forget Irving Kristol was unique in that he said, fine, call me a neoconservative. His friends, Nathan Glazer, Daniel Bell, who were part of that first wave of kind of skeptical, melioristic approaches to public policy, both of them were always uncomfortable with the label neoconservative. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was also part of that group, he eventually abandoned it altogether and became kind of just a reflexive liberal Democrat, at least in his votes in the Senate. So there's always going to be some discomfort. But I guess my answer to your question is I don't really see a critical mass developing right now. I think the current structure of the right is going to be here for a while yet.
Matthew Continetti is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and was the founding editor and editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today on Acton Line.
Thanks for having me.
As always, thank you so much for listening today. Our team loves putting this show together for you every week, and it's so encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can reach our team at actonline@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Eric Cohn.